As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of The Malcolm Effect for what is going to be a very interesting, exciting, and important episode in this time, given the geopolitical state of the world right now, specifically focusing on Gaza and Palestine. And we are going to speak about Iran's response and what does it mean for the region in this time. Joining us as our guest, a voice you have become familiar with, one of my favorite people, a mentor and a teacher, Dr. Matteo Capasso. How's it going?
Thank you, Mamadou, for inviting me again. It's always a pleasure to meet you and speak about the state of this chaotic world, indeed.
No, absolutely. And joining me, I have two co-hosts today, a voice you're familiar with, Christian, and my newly found brother, Aiden Khamis, for the first time on The Malcolm Effect. So we're going to go straight into it, and I'm going to ask my first question. I guess let's just set the scene a little bit. What was your initial response or reaction when you had heard that Iran launched their attack?
That's a good question. To understand the initial thoughts that I had, I would probably draw a comparison with February 2022, which is when Russia launched this military operation in Ukraine. And I say that because to basically convey the message that initially the way the Western media started to portray the potential attack of Iran, I did not immediately believe that this was going to happen in the scale and magnitude and capacities also shown by Iran in the moment it did decide to do that. So initially I was a little bit skeptical, is this going to happen really? Because it's also, when we look at what happened so far, we've seen the axis of resistance, these social formations emerging from the region in the aftermath, of the 1990s, consolidating since the 1990s in the aftermath also of the Iranian Revolution in 1979. So the social political formation has really embraced this idea of strategic patience. So slowly going at war with Israel, but never so far we had seen an attack on the Zionist entity in 75 years since its existence. I mean, we have to go back probably to the 42 Scud missiles that Saddam Hussein launched in the 1990s towards Tel Aviv and another Zionist city. But when you look at what happened, I mean, it's not impossible to understand why Iran did so. And it's clear because on April 1st, this is something, that it also tells us of the amount of terror, of terrorist and criminal actions that we have normalized when it comes to Israel. The fact that they went and bombed on the 1st of April of this month and a consulate in a foreign country, killing 16 people inside that consulate is just unbelievable. And it makes me think also what David Cameron was the British, one of the foreign minister, I think right now, talking about Iranians' actions as so vicious, absolutely as an act of terror. And then when he's asked, what do our country do if our consulate would be bombed somewhere in the world? Oh, we would take a very strong reaction to that. So initial definitely surprise, a sense of surprise, because it is difficult to completely understand the type of action that Iran would have taken. But when you look at it and what you see what Iran has done, I'm actually glad that this happened.
Thank you so much. And I think I also watched that clip with David Cameron. And once again, as they say, you scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds. Because the hypocrisy of the Western world we are seeing day in and day out continues to be exposed. So my follow-up question then becomes, have we entered a new phase, a new stage in this conflict?
I would say absolutely. What happened is historic. I mean, for the first time, a key social formation in the axis of resistance has entered the war directly from its own territory. This is definitely a step. It signals, it marks the enter of a new stage. Now, this means several things, obviously. First and foremost, it's not the event itself, as we know, but as historical materialists, we always look at the, what happens in history. I mean, what unfolds at the present by looking at history, obviously. So what do we see? We see that since October 7th, the situation has progressively escalated. Several times, Israel has been taken off guard, has been attacked by each and every element inside the axis of resistance. Iran is the attack on Iran by Israel, and then the retaliatory attack by Iran according to the UN Charter, because let's not forget that Iran acted on the basis of the international law defensively after what Israel had done, is definitely it marks the entry to a new stage. Why? Because what we're seeing now is that the deterrence of Israel is getting increasingly smaller. It is being shattered by the day. It is important for us to understand that what happened on October 7th, it's not so much the Palestinians gaining their agency and so on and so forth. What is really happening is that the idea of Israel, the idea of an entity, a foreign entity, based on criminal actions, on the killing and on the genocide of people, and on the maintenance of this system, on absolute violence and repression, has been compromised. And it has been compromised because the people inside the region are teaching us a lesson that once you are united, when you come together to fight the foreign forces that are trying to subjugate you, to repress you, you are able, there is no matter what the military basis, no matter what the force and the violence that they're going to use against you, you have and you can build the power to bring forward a revolutionary action that compromises this foreign interest. And this is what we're seeing. The entrance of Iran specifically, it just marks the fact that the most important actor inside this social formation, this united front that we refer to as the axis of resistance, has officially entered directly the war. Is this going to the next level? We will have to see.
Yeah. So my question for you, Matteo, is the idea that a lot of people are parroting this rhetoric that what Iran's retaliation was merely theatrics. And I think a lot of rhetoric saying that the Zionist entity wants a full-scale war in the region automatically makes it seem that Iran isn't ready for escalation. It isn't ready for, being engaged. And so to what degree is Iran ready for engagement? What is its intent with this retaliation? And is this this new calculus, this new rules of engagement by this strategic strike?
I think that your question has two heads in a way to which we can both answer. The first one is the question of the theatrics, okay, that we have to address. All those who are defining the actions of Iran and the actions of the resistance axis in relation to Palestine as a theatrical gesture, as a circus, as something that Iran is only doing for self-interest, and it has nothing to do with the liberation of Palestine, for the popular people, for the popular classes of Palestine, for the people of Iran, and so on and so forth. Those analysts, whatever you want to call them, although they should be called clowns at this point, they are embracing a class position, because this is what we have to think ourselves. All the ideological positions that are being now exposed in relation to Iran, this type of analysis that they refer to Iran as an authoritarian regime, as you were saying, as some sort of theatrics happening, they are producing the ideological ground necessary for a certain mode of social reproduction, which is the one under US-led imperialism. Because the moment you ideologically undermine the military force that is at the core of what we are seeing today, since October 7th actually, happening in Palestine, then it means that you are willingly or unwillingly supporting US imperialism. This is not a minor point. It is very important for us to understand, because we're seeing this happening also amongst many people who define themselves as pro-Palestine. And the question goes back to the idea of how we are framing what is happening here. Is this a humanitarian situation? Are we only interested to depict the Palestinians as people suffering under the genocidal violence of the Israelis and actually the Zionist and US imperialism? Or are we looking at Palestine as at the core of a structure? That structure being US imperialism, which is organically connected to the Zionist entity in the region. So the moment the Palestinians strike a military operation at the core interest of US imperialism in the region, which is Zionism, then we need to understand that national liberation can only happen to a project of regional solidarity. And in that equation of regional solidarity, the axis of resistance is central to undo imperialism. The idea of theatrics is also a way, obviously, to delegitimize the military support that Iran has provided to all the different elements of the axis. The capacity, the space of autonomy. This is something that I keep repeating all the time, because it's not a question of direct coordination between Iran and the various elements. It's not Iran says so, the other ones, they're just puppets doing what Iran says. No, it's a question of being able to create the necessary autonomy for different elements, social formations in the region to gain that strategic and military capacity, for example, to produce their own weapons, and eventually start protecting militarily their own interest. Meaning what? That they are not anymore at the mercy of Zionist deterrence, at the mercy of economic warfare of the US, and so on and so forth. In other words, they are regaining their material means to defend their developmental path and to produce an alternative to the one imposed by US imperialism in the region. So that's the first question of theatrics. The second one, I think there are 2 points important here. The first one is that we really believe, especially in the core, in the West, even those that are pro-Palestine believe that anything that the Axis does is buying into the game of Israel, of US imperialism, and so on. But as we said before, with the strike of Iran, the retaliatory strike of Iran towards the Zionist entity, we entered a new phase of the war. But the new phase had already started. History had already moved, changed, with the cumulatively happening of different historical events. October 7 being one of them. And the significance of these events is that, again, the question of autonomy. I say autonomy because I despise the word agency, which exists only in English. I don't think it exists in Arabic or in Italian, in French. It's an American invention. In fact, it connects to the Central Intelligence Agency. In any case, autonomy is key here. What we're seeing with Iran and with the axis of resistance is their capacity to act against Israeli Zionist deterrence and US imperialist interest in the region. So the idea, to entertain the idea that Iran acts and falls into the trap of what the Israel wants or the US wants is basically to believe that the US and Israel somehow are still capable of controlling the dynamics of the region. We are way beyond past this stage. And it's beautiful that I'm talking to the three of you guys because you're younger, but you are also the next generation. You are living a moment of change that we haven't seen in a long time. We're talking about, and what I'm referring to is the long consolidation of the unipolar moment happening in the 1980s and the 90s, even if, we could disagree on the fact that it was always perfectly consolidated and fully in control of the situation. But what we've seen since the fall of the Berlin Wall was the UN sanctions decade. Intervention after intervention in the countries of the global south. Yugoslavia was destroyed by NATO. Libya, Iraq, Syria, it's a constant, Afghanistan, Yemen, it's a constant, cumulative act of aggression by the US and its allies over the global south. The number of sanctions, of sanctions regimes that have been imposed across Africa, across Asia, across, Latin America. We are witnessing a moment which starts obviously cumulatively, but that whose centrality goes back, as you all know, to the capacity of China to rise, to emerge against neoliberalism, so creating a space of developmental autonomy for its own country, inevitably produces its own results in other regions of the world. We've seen that with Russia, and now we're seeing this in the region.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you bringing us back to, all of us on this call are Marxists. And I think it's so important in this time that we return to a materialist analysis. Something you said about those reflecting a class position, I want to ask you, you see this time and time again on quote unquote leftist Twitter. And just for the record, I am not a leftist, because if leftism is what is on Twitter nowadays, I am not that. I'm a Marxist Leninist, yeah? Because some of the stuff that gets touted as a left politics is you sound like stenographers for the State Department. So now people are saying, the internal contradictions within Iran. Oh, Iran treats its women in a certain way. Oh, Iran is repressive. They're authoritarian. It doesn't matter. You don't want an authoritarian, repressive, misogynistic regime to support the Palestinians. What do you say about that?
You see, the good thing about history and the good thing about having witnessed this kind of rhetoric before is that in a way we are able to weaponize and to use the past to against this type of arguments. The gist of the arguments here is that although the US, the European partners, and the Zionist entity are imperialist, those regimes are fascist, right? So what they're trying to create is somehow that the point that there is an equation between imperialism against fascism. So they are all bad, in other words. So that we come out with a moral, not an analytical judgment, obviously, with a moral and political position that is meant to obliterate these countries by demonizing their leadership. Through what? Through the use of internal contradictions. We've seen this in Libya in 2011, where, for example, and it's happening right now with Iran, where all the political problems of the country are attributed to the authoritarian, paranoid, and evil character of one single man or personality or group of people, whether it could be Bashar al-Assad, Muammar Gaddafi, or in the case of Iran would be, the Ayatollahs and so on and so forth. We see the way in which this is problematized. They do so because the point is to disarticulate this socio-political formation and their transformation from the structure. That's where the structural analysis is not missing, is purposefully not being done. Because the moment you do a structural analysis, the moment you understand that we live, because this is the beauty of the structural analysis that we do here, is the fact that it's not that we want to say, imperialism is the source of all evils. No, on the contrary, what we're trying to say is that we are all connected into the structures. But we need to understand the mechanisms of power, the hierarchical mechanism of power, that the laws of development that allow these structures to maintain itself. So the moment we don't see that all the internal contradictions that Iran has have also to do with 30 years of sanctions. So basically you are asking me to say, Iran should have developed a gender equality agenda that is the same as the one in the US. What is missing from this argument? First, the fact that the developmental progress that the US and the West has done is based on the exploitation and subjugation of the global South, including Iran. The ideological weight, meaning the ideas, the concept, the analysis, by this I mean not just neoliberalism, but even gender itself, that the way gender has consolidated in the West is premised on this material exploitation. So the moment I am trying to make an equal comparison between two parts of the world, that they are dialectically connected via an unequal exchange, I am already committing an analytical crime. On the contrary, what needs to happen is that the moment you recognize that there is an unequal exchange that is at the core of the laws of development that structure our own world, then I need to be able to maintain that unequal intellectual analysis. By unequal, I don't mean that anything that any country does should be justified, but I need to understand that the categories that I'm using to judge or that they have developed through the genocide, the crimes committed by the West, the sanctions, the killing of thousands of children in Gaza cannot be used to label or to describe what is happening in Iran. The moment Iran is has the capacity to live under imperialist privilege, is the possibility to be allowed autonomous development without sanctions and so on and so forth, then we can start judging the question of gender differently. Look at what is happening, and here I would very much recommend we launched a Ramadan course for the journal I am editor of, Middle East Critique, and one of the speaker, Walal Qaisiya, she spoke about the notion of ungendering when it comes to what is happening in Gaza. And it's interesting. Why? And it's very useful also to respond to your question, Mamadou, because she says we are seeing Zionists planting LGBT flags in the midst of the rubble of Gaza. And then they're coming to us and saying, oh, you really want Hamas as the political spokesperson of the Palestinian people? What would happen to gay people, to LGBT, and so on and so forth? Gender, in the ways in which it is constructed as an ideology, cannot be separated from the material exploitation that the West has done towards the global South. The bombs that are constantly coming over the skies of Gaza do not look at the people or the Palestinian people through a gender lens. They are meant to kill them, whether they are women, they are children, or they're men. They ungender them. There is no gender there. There is just fucking blood. So anytime that this question of gender comes back, we need to remind all these people using these categories of the ways in which these categories themselves have consolidated historically. Then we can start a different discussion.
So Biden has stated that the U.S. will not participate in any offensive action against Iran, but history has shown us that the U.S. has an unwavering allegiance to Israel. And in fact, yesterday, on April 15th, in a Pentagon press briefing, Major General Pat Ryder stated that our support for Israel's defense is ironclad, and that we will support Israel's defense. Do you think that these contradictions expose Biden and the U.S.'s false commitment to quote-unquote stability in the region? What does stability mean to the West from a political economic perspective?
So, when we look at history as facts and not as empty statements devoid of any impact on reality, then what the US is saying is honestly irrelevant at this stage. I mean, let's just look at what the US has done in the last few months. It has not avoided a regional war, because we keep saying, oh, are we going to have a regional war? We have a regional war. The question is how much we're normalizing in the process. How much do we think that we need to get into a regional war? Does it need to reach us? Do the people of Gaza, of Lebanon, of Yemen, and Iraq, do they really think that they're not into a war already? They are in a war. They know they are in a war. It's going to go further than this. Do we need to all reach the stage of Gaza? We are into a regional war. Iran has sent missiles coming from its own territory towards Israel. Since October 7th, the situation has escalated gradually and progressively, okay? So the US has not done anything to avoid this war. And what it has done, on the contrary, is just sent thousands and thousands of ammunitions and missiles that have butchered the people of Gaza. They have butchered the people of Gaza and the people of southern Lebanon and also Iraq. So in other words, the US is an active part of this genocide. We know that. Then another point that is very important, because we always have to go back to the same tropes, which then I will go back to, also to your question. The US, Zionism is America. America is Zionism. We know that. The US government is at the core of the imperialist structure. Israel would not be able to withstand any military capacity of the regional axis without the economic and military support that the US provides. So even when we're looking at US statements, we need to remind ourselves that the Zionist entity is at the core of US interest. The US cannot lose Zionism. It is fundamental. It's not the other way around. I'm sure you guys have talked about the perils and limitations and actually uselessness of talking about the Zionist lobby and so on and so forth. The dialectical, the organic connection between the US, there is a dialectical and organic connection between the US and Israel. Because Israel incarnates US imperialist interest in the region. By creating this terrorist organization entity in the region, I make sure that I de-develop the region. But by de-develop, I make sure that the region does not autonomously develops from US interest. So that's the core of Israel here, right there in the region. Now, based on this, the contradictions we are facing are two. First, the fact that the US government claims to its people, to its constituency, to the liberals that believe in this propaganda, that it pursues a foreign policy based on values. And so every time we follow these statements, we believe, I don't mean us, but in the process, people who listen to them, we listen to them and we think that they are true somehow. But this is where the major contradiction lies. The US, by being at the core structure of the imperialist imperialist structure, embraces the role of a rogue state. It's the policeman of the world. So it has a direct interest to keep Israel strong and secure in the region. Now, the problem with the US is that is locked in a situation where is not able to produce a political agenda with a long-term horizon, with a long-term plan. Just look at the type of people that the political class of the US produces. You have a clown like Donald Trump and a senile person like Joe Biden. These are leaders of a key country of the structure of the world who claims to export democratic value to the world. And look who's leading them. I don't believe obviously in the person per se, but the fact that this is what they are producing, it's already indicative of the decline that this country is undergoing. The only type of political action the US can produce is on a short term. The US is locked in what I call a bulimic temporal dimension of financial capitalism. They can just extract at a very short and quick tempo. And this type of contradiction of long-term plan vis-a-vis the requirements of late-stage financial capitalism and decline in which the US is replicated in the ways in which the Axis is fighting the war and Israel is doing. Israel wants a quick, devastating war of the type of the one that is doing in Gaza across the whole region. That's why he wants a regional war. He wants it quick. He wants to bring the US in because they have to do it quick. The US, for internal reasons, cannot do that completely. But as other statements from the State Department also indicate, we will do anything that we need to support Israel, even if we disapprove of what Israel is doing. At the same time, the Axis has developed this capacity, it's called strategic patience, and wants a slow war of attrition that is paying back already. And I repeat, this is why we're seeing that the idea of Israel has been compromised. Because the long war of attrition is going to make, as already it's happening, Israel an unsustainable ally for the West and for the comprador reactionary regime inside the region. Why unsustainable? Because we are already seeing from a moral and international point of view the terrorism, the criminality, the utter Nazism that the political classes of Israel and the society itself incarnates. It's a project that runs against humanity.
Yeah, you kind of built on the Axis's strategic patience and the war of attrition and working collectively. And I'm just curious, kind of transitioning to, again, in these actions, and how, again, if we go back to specifically the retaliation, how the retaliation is actively supporting the Palestinian resistance. I mean, Hamas released a statement reaffirming Iran's right to self-defense. The PFLP released a similar statement adding on to that, but also adding the strategic importance of this retaliation in terms of the resistance. So what is this retaliation doing specifically to empower the resistance in Gaza and just all across Palestine in this current time?
This retaliation is key. As we said before, in relation to the question of the new stage of the war, this retaliation has not just a symbolic theatrical meaning. Its meaning is material, which is anytime Israel is going to think that it can take action, military action, on Iranian interest, for example, in the region, Iran now is going to directly intervene. What is basically showing is that something that we already knew, but it's materializing. That is the difference. And this is where it has such a heavy importance for us when we're looking at the actions of Iran and the consequences, the positive consequences that it has for the resistance. Because a direct military intervention signals that Iran is ready to enter the war, is already at war. Now, this connects, though, to the question that you posed earlier about people saying, oh, Iran has entered, but it hasn't hit or killed thousands of people in Israel, and so this means that this was just a theatrical move. This is where we have to go back to Frantz Fanon. And I mentioned Fanon, although this has been a recurring theme in all the revolutionary intellectual production in the Global South, in those states, in the social formations that decided to rebel, to find their path towards an autonomous development. Ernesto Che Guevara talks in the same way. Even Muammar Gaddafi talks in the same way. What am I talking about? The need for a different morality and spirituality when we're launching the struggle for liberation. The possibility that Iran was going to kill indiscriminately civilians inside Israel is something that only those who think through the terrorist and criminal mentality of the Zionist and the West can imagine. To imagine a different world, one without the Zionist entity, where Palestine is finally liberated from the river to the sea, you also have to think and emerge out of all this violence with a different morality, a different spiritual course, a different vision for the future. One that takes into account, that translates materially also into the type of military actions undertaken. And this is where we've seen this, not just in the case of Iran. We've seen this happening across all the different types of interventions that the different social formations within the resistance axis have pursued, have launched. Yemen, they haven't killed people. They blockaded, and they're going after they imposed a naval blockade, and they trying to attack key infrastructural sites of the entity. Hezbollah, its major attacks so far have been always against soldiers, have been always against military infrastructures. There is no indiscriminate bombing of people. Never. This is rational. This is not they don't want to tell us, they are so focused to tell us, oh, these are authoritarian regimes. And look then how this authoritarianism, this clownish analysis that they give us, translates into material actions. And the material actions show us that actually they are the moral actors. They are the ones with a true humanitarian agenda here. They are trying to stop a genocide. We're talking about 76,000 people, including the people who are dead, people that are losing limbs, people that, most likely they will not live another day because of the wounds, that have been purposely attacked, targeted by Israel with full support of the West. Humanity is emerging from the rubbles of these bombs, and it is connected to these actors of the region. It is a fact. It's not anything else. This is what we're seeing here. This is why there is the importance of this attack for the entire axis, because it's showing that Iran is there. Iran is ready to enter the battle, but it's never going to do so at the tempo, as we were discussing before, of the type of war that Israel wants for itself and for the region.
Thank you so much for that. And I think once again, you're raising so many of the important moving parts. And I think this moment has shown the strategic vision of the axis. So when we think about Hezbollah clearing out the north of Israel, we all know that the stage of the settler project that is Israel now is far different to let's say, the United States of America. The project in Israel requires people to be there. That's why they're still handing out passports and visas and citizenship. It requires settlements for its project. Hezbollah is blocking that in the north of Israel. By Iran shooting the rockets in the way it did, it exhausted $1.3 billion of Israel's defense and showed that Israel needs the US and UK to back it up. What that does is also create and heighten the contradictions within Israel. It also creates a state of panic for people in Israel, and you're destroying the settler project from the inside. You're heightening those contradictions. By going over Jordan, what we see is that you're heightening the contradictions within Jordan. People are seeing that their king is subservient to the West. So I feel like I'm not a military strategist in any sense of the word, but just looking at it and reading the analysis, I'm thinking, like, how can you not see that this is like a great strategic vision on the part of Iran?
That's right. That's absolutely right. I mean, what you're saying, it's so central. I mean, Mamadou, the fact that this is a project that requires settlement. And what we're seeing so far is that the entire north of occupied Palestine is being gradually evacuated. And then the entire Gaza envelope, all the people, the settlers in this area are leaving this territory. Their attachment to the land is based on a settler project, meaning on violence. And it is a different stage, obviously, of the US, Australia, and so on and so forth. This means that the people that are organic to the land have not abandoned. The gun has not fallen from the revolutionary hands yet. And this cycle of cumulative resistance, the cycles of resistance that the Palestinians have launched across the years. Think about the first intifada, second intifada, being in Lebanon, in Jordan, even with different projects and with their own limitations that then, some of them, they became part of that imperialist structures itself and comprador and so on and so forth. They have constantly rised against this project. And this project can only exist if it receives the Western material backing. Without that, it does not survive. And again, that's why Al-Aqsa flood is central, because it has gifted us something, the clarity. Now, you cannot come to us as in the 1990s, when I was talking about before, that you would see Bill Clinton being a mediator between the Palestinians and Israel. Now we know exactly what the US represents. The US represents Zionism, is an active part into this genocide. So nobody's going to accept that anymore. And let's talk about the reactionary elements of the region. The intervention of Iran, it is another blow to the process and to the drums of war and normalization that have been up and running for so many years now. I mean, think about it. The Abraham Accords, they aimed at reconfiguring the region, okay? Their aim was, we normalize the existence of this criminal entity, and we do so in order to focus in another part of the region. This was the US government. We are withdrawing slowly. We give the keys of this region of our interest to the reactionary allies and Israel so that we can focus on China. What they didn't realize is that the rise of China had already created a space of autonomy for other actors in that region. And this is where October 7 stings, more than stings, the project of normalization. Because we have been showered progressively by humiliation, by turning words like surrender into peace and bravery. What we're seeing now is that these reactionary forces are feeling the pressure on the face of these intensifying contradictions inside the region. And so, before Jordan decided to provide its airspace and to actively contribute to shooting down Iranian drones, we've seen the amount of protests that were taking place inside the region, inside Jordan itself. The effects of these events, they are going to reverberate across this region for years. And I'd give you an example, which I know, Mamadou, you are very fond of. Central and West Africa. A wave of revolutionary military coup happening from 2020 up to now. Key to each one of them, and it's not because I work on Libya, but key to each one of them was the dismantlement of the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya in 2011. So we're talking about 10 years after we are seeing governments in Central and West Africa saying enough to Western and French imperialism. Why is this connected? Because the moment Libya fell, you had AFRICOM coming in, US, French military troops, German ones coming in Central and West Africa, jihadi groups being armed by the same weapons that had been given to the so-called Libyan rebels. Libya, yes, is destroyed, but a new wave of anti-imperialism is coming out now. The same is going to happen in this region. We need to have an historical analysis, obviously, but we can also focus directly on the present now. The misery now that we're seeing, the suffering of the Palestinian people is a bitter one. But the gains that we are actually going to sow in the future out of what the resistance axis is doing now are going to be a bless for the entire humanity.
Thank you. Christian, do you have follow-up?
Yeah. Actually, touching on Jordan and their support to Israel during this retaliatory attack from Iran, I wanted to ask if you could clarify not just Jordan, but also Saudi Arabia and UAE, who also provided support to Israel during this attack. Could you provide some sort of historical or economic analysis to explain their reactionary behavior?
Yeah, I think there are a first point which Mamadou mentioned before, which it's very important. You talked about 1 billion and something in terms of expenses that Israel had to sustain in order to intercept what they call clownishly, 99.9
percent.
percent of drone interception of Iranian drones, which is not true, obviously. Whereas Iran has only spent 35 million, using mostly its older weaponry, while at the same time having the capacity to test and to see what are the abilities of the entity to protect itself. So militarily, we already have seen a disproportionate use of expenses from what Iran has done and the way Israel and the money that Israel needed to spend to defend itself. But in terms of economic analysis, we have to go back to two, I think the first is the historical materialist, obviously, analysis that we need, which is the triad. We need to go back to the triad in the region. This is something that Palestinian leftists developed back in the days. It was the Arab Marxist and so on and so forth, but we need to update now and understand. The first one, the elements of the triad are three, obviously. Imperialism, Zionism, and reactionism. Now, how are these three elements connected? We talked about Israel and the relation to imperialism, settler colony, mode of consciousness that aligns with the one of the US, is an investment in US, Israel is an investment in US-led militarism. We destroy the region in order so that the region does not autonomously develop away from US imperialist interest. In this process, obviously, there is the role of reactionism. Now, historically, reactionism goes back to the centrality of oil that the region had to the US financialized economy. So the Gulf monarchies traded their political security, basically allowing the US military to come into the region, to protect them. That's why we have the Fifth Fleet, numerous military bases, thousands of military bases in the region, especially in the Gulf, because they traded. They screened themselves. We don't have to worry about our political survival. There is the US taking care of us. No, none of these elements, social formations in the region who want a different developmental path can attack us because the US is going to defend us. What do we need to give for that? What do we need to do in order to receive this? We need to make sure that we trade oil in US dollars and flood the market with oil or withdraw oil according to what the US wants. So the bargain has always been that. So Saudi Arabia in 1985, for example, floods the market with oil. It creates the so-called oil gluts, which have a detrimental, devastating impact on oil-rich economies like Libya, Iran, and the USSR back in the 1980s, because the prices of oil goes down. So these countries receive less revenue. Now, with the money of this revenue, these social formations, USSR, Iran, and Libya, they did not want to abide to US orders, imperialist orders. They wanted to try to create a different developmental path for the different regions of the world in which they were operating. The moment you pulled the plug from them, they have less money to do so. So that's already one of the things. But overall, the importance of reactionism is that you provide not just a military footprint of the US in the region, but you allow the circulation and the primacy of the dollar in the US, in the international economy. So the US is always screened, because if a major commodity at the level of trade is actually traded in dollars, then you are controlling the economy of the world, the international political economy, okay? What we're seeing nowadays, though, it's not just oil now. We're going beyond. One of the key elements here that we need to talk about is logistics. And that's why we have to go back, guess where, Christian? To China. Because, and this is also where we see the contradictions inside the region itself. Because the US has become now, it doesn't need oil anymore. And at the same time, the failure of all these wars, the destruction that the US has brought upon the region, is also making other countries aware that, and the weaponization of the dollar, let's not forget that, through sanctions, is making countries of the region, and China and Russia, and the BRICS and so on and so forth, all these different social formation, much more aware of the need to establish alternative political organization. Because we don't want to get trapped in a situation where you can weaponize the dollar against us, and then my economy goes down. So what happens here? This is why this is important to understand the current situation. So in 2008, the economy of China, 49% of the GDP of China was in US dollars, okay? In 2008, we have also a major financial crisis. That financial crisis, which was connected to the subprime mortgage market and so on and so forth, which we're not going to go into that right now, but basically financial recession takes place in the US, okay? But the moment a financial recession takes place in the US, it involves the dollar. The moment it involves the dollar, it affects the entire world. Because if my currency, if me, living in the government of the global south, my own currency is pegged to the dollar, the moment the dollar goes down, my own currency also goes down. The problem is that the US has the imperial clout to recover itself, perhaps by launching a war. Me, government of the global south, I don't have that imperialist privilege. So when we look at the developmental trajectory of China, we see that China imbricates itself in the international political structure because it has to do so. We are living under capitalism. To have this idea of pure socialist paradise is something that we leave to the Trotskyites. We need to be realist. So China develops within that system, and by 2008, 49% of its GDP is in US dollars and securities. The recession hits, and China realizes that having all these dollars is a risk. It had been a reward up to a certain extent because by buying US bonds and security, you are buying a secure form of debt. You're buying something that financially is secure. Why is that secure? Because the US is stable, is powerful. If you do something to the US, it's going to nuke you. That's why the stability, the financial stability, is always connected to the military equation. By 2008, though, China decides that this is a risk for us. So we need to unload this 49% of our GDP in US dollars. How do we do that? The One Belt, One Road initiative is being launched. Now, this is key because what China does is translates these dollars into actual infrastructural projects. So materiality, it tries to build infrastructures around the world. That's where we start seeing ports, train infrastructure, airports, and so on and so forth, okay? And it does so not in countries of the core, of the imperialist core. It starts looking at the global south, Africa, Latin America, Asia, and so on and so forth. In this project of infrastructural development, logistics and corridors become key because this has always been the civilizational exchange that China has given to the world, even in the past. The Silk Road, the capacity to create these long roads to connect people, okay? And the strait, the Gulf, becomes key. Why? It becomes key now, since the early 2010 for the US. Why? Because in order to counter the strategic rise of China and the increasing construction of logistical ports, the famous trope of the string of pearls, basically this idea that China is building ports in Southeast Asia in order to control that region, or whereas it's simply creating connectivity, is allowing different countries to connect in a different form of development, giving them also the responsibility to decide what kind of form of development they want to take. The US, in the face of all this building, all this infrastructure, all this production of something that can benefit the development of people and governments of the global south, what is offering the US? What did it offer up until 2008, the US? And after that, war, militarism, destruction, neoliberalism. So in order to counter, because we already see the different types of development here, China and the US. In order to counter the construction of all this logistical infrastructure, the US comes up with the idea of building a counter-logistical corridor. And this is where we go back to the economic analysis that you asked me about the role of reactionary forces of the region. In this project, what becomes key for the US is to create a corridor between India, which is India a socialist country? I guess we know the answer.
No.
Exactly. Is the logistical corridor needs to go through India, the Gulf. Obviously, we don't have to, the Gulf is not a socialist paradise either. Passing through Israel and then reaching Europe. So the project of normalization that we see in these years, 2010, the destruction of Syria, the destruction of Libya, is not just a destruction out of, oh, look, these are people that ideologically have been against us. No, these are countries that stand in the way, possibly standing in the way materially for us to build this type of infrastructural project. So this is where, for example, there is all this analysis about, for example, the gas being in the northern part of the sea in front of Gaza. These are just elements that would potentially connect. Sorry, not potentially. These are elements that are important for us to understand, but only if inserted into a structural analysis. You have to look, for example, at the Ben Gurion Canal, the idea that Israel was going to build a canal that countered the Suez one. So this all, or the project NEOM that Saudi Arabia was supposed to create, which connected then to the Ben Gurion Canal. And the fact that in 2014, if I am correct, Sisi in Egypt relinquishes, it gives away 2 islands to Saudi Arabia. 2 islands that are key to this potential infrastructural project that could connect Israel to Saudi Arabia, then to India. And in all this, there is the question of gas, coming from Qatar, coming from the Gulf, from the UAE, and so on and so forth, which becomes so central, especially when the US decides that Europe needs to, I'm going to use the word de-link, but it's that the EU needs to go at war with Russia. And this is where the EU loses any form of whatever strategic political independence it had, consolidating its role as a vassal of the US. So the Middle East, the region of West Asia, becomes so central for us to understand, because the US needs control of this region. It needs to normalize Israel. It needs to do so vis-a-vis the Gulf countries, but it's not able to do that. Why? Because Iran, at the same time, is still there. Iran has withstood 30 years and plus of sanctions. And how did Iran withstood 30 years plus of sanctions? Indigenous capacity? Obviously. But most importantly, thanks to China. So China, it is important to understand this fact. The fact that China the cooperation that China establishes with countries like Iran does not mean that China tells Iran, you need to, we are supporting your economic development, we are breaking the sanctions, and we are supporting you, we are buying your oil, because then you need to go and liberate Palestine. That's not the point here. The point is that China engages with the global south, engages with countries under sanctions, and in doing that, it creates the space of autonomy. That's what I was talking about before, which is obviously, as also we can call it, it gives the opportunity to these countries to maintain a material and political control of their sovereignty. and autonomous political material, economic, and political development. So what this creates, how does this translate then into the region, is that the moment Iran gains the economic possibility to pursue a different developmental path despite 30 years of pressure of sanctions, then Iran gains first a space of autonomy. That space of autonomy then translates into its own yard, into its own region, and especially into safeguarding its own security inside that region, supporting all the socio-political forces that understand the centrality of safeguarding their own political interest and economic interest in the region. And this is where the axis emerges. But in this process, just one step back, economic cooperation is key, yes, but also what is as key for Iran at this point is also the capacity to become militarily independent, to secure militarily, to be able to defend its own territory. And what Iran does is starts a military cooperation with Russia, Russia selling patents of weapons that then are built in Iran. Iran gets the know-how and its own technology, like China had done back in the days when all the American factories were relocating to China. And in doing this, it also gains the nuclear capabilities, the know-how from the DPRK, from North Korea. So you are seeing a cooperation here from Khan. This is where we are seeing multipolarity in action. And how does this translate to the region? In the fight for the liberation of Palestine. Now, the fight for the liberation of Palestine, it is a religious fight. After all, Zionism is the most reactionary religious project that we have ever witnessed. But to understand what is happening only through a religious lens does not make us understand that there is a material equation here that is fundamental. Iran and the Axis, in order to protect their own national project, their own sovereignty, they need to come together regionally, and they need to make sure that they liberate Palestine, they control, they rebalance the Zionist entity. Because the Zionist entity, as we know, as we said before, is key for the de-development of that region away from US imperialism. If you want to be directly connected to US imperialism, then you normalize with Israel. If you're trying to develop in a direction that challenges or simply tries to create an autonomous path, then you are faced and you are forced to confront the Zionist question, which is the Palestinian question.
Thank you very much. Christian, I think you had a question.
Yeah, so I wanted to follow up on your comments on China. I greatly appreciate how you've explained the development of China and China's developmental process, aiding the developmental process of other countries in the global south, creating kind of like an economic precondition for the conflict in West Asia and that region, and creating that space of autonomy. However, I'm wondering if you think that, as you said earlier, the retaliatory attack from Iran marks a change in the conflict we're seeing right now in the region of Western Asia. Do you think that retaliatory attack may also change the relationship that China has with the region? Do you foresee any support that may be increased given recent events? Do you think that the China may seek to intensify the contradictions and conflict it has with Western economic dominance through this conflict?
No, it makes sense, Christian. It's a great question. And it's not an easy one to answer, I have to say, at the same time. Because as much as polarization and intensification of the contradictions and the war, because we have to go back also to a little bit of the intellectual production, revolutionary intellectual production and communist production that was coming from China, especially from Chairman Mao, when he talks about the form and the forms of the contradiction. Contradictions will always exist in society. But that question that we are faced with is what forms these contradictions are going to take. And at this point in history, the forms of the contradictions are incarnating themselves, are materializing through war and militarism. That is what is intensifying this the question of time. That's why we perceive time and space, literally epistemologically, as much more intensely, because the intensification of the contradiction in the form of war makes us feel the violence, the death. So it is imposing itself on us in a much stronger way than, say, when there is an hegemonic order and we're not feeling all these contradictions around us. So the polarization, the intensification of the contradictions that it's happening in the region, and that is going to force these reactionary regimes to take a side, to reveal themselves naked to their own people and eventually be overthrown or change their position, is also affecting China right now. But it has been affecting China for a long time, because the war on China starts the moment a long time ago, when the US realizes the capacities of China. Now, all these different situations, whether it's Ukraine or Palestine, directly affect China as well. Now, what we've seen when we look back at history is that China has always tried to maintain and to have a foreign policy, or to guide its own foreign policy through 5 principles of non-interference. So China does economic exchange, trade exchange, infrastructural, political, and so on and so forth, but it's not going to intervene directly into the conflict. So when we look at China, then we're like those of us who are looking at the Palestinian question, and they're seeing the blood and the suffering. We're like, when is China going to do something? Hasn't China done enough? We need China to do more. The question is that we cannot think of China as a savior. We are not living in an Hollywood-made American movie where we have somebody who's going to save Palestine and the region. Actually, what we are living, and this again, we see the beauty of this moment that we're living, is that literally all these fantasies about agencies that the West injects into young people are actually incarnating, materializing themselves into in the region of West Asia, because people finally have decided to take their destiny into their own hands. This is happening right now. So the role that China could play, and again, we enter a speculative terrain here in terms of hypothesis, what could happen, what could not happen, but we've seen happening so far at least, is that China is certainly trying to use instruments like international law for the benefit of, for example, the Palestinians. And we have seen this also done by other countries like South Africa. So in this process of intensified contradictions, the military equation is central, because it's the balance of forces here that we are seeing being displaced, shifting in the region, and there is an axis directly fighting against the entity which represents the entire Western imperialist structure. The countries around that have created that helped and cumulatively to create this space of autonomy for the axis in the region might not necessarily involve themselves directly into the conflict, but they might use other diplomatic, for example, tools to put further pressure to the imperialist, whether being international law or even the creation of alternative structures for the legal international order. Because perhaps the UN or the International Criminal Justice Court are so structurally connected to the imperialist power of the US and the West that they are inherently doomed as tools. So my feeling is that we have to be able to think not just analytically, but also strategically. When we look at countries like China and others, what can these countries do in order to support, or to create, again, not to support, that's the thing that we need to also be able to get around it, to create a space of autonomy that we didn't have before. So when China goes and claims at the International Criminal Court of Justice that the Palestinians have a right to armed struggle, this is very important for us. At the same time, when China brings together to the mediating table Iran and Saudi Arabia, is showing that it has a balanced and capacity to act as a mediator between two potentially conflicting social formations. So we are seeing, and we have to be able to think differently when we look at the rise of this new order, because we need, and this is very hard for all of us, but this is why we need to go back to the literature about the intellectual production about the new man, the new revolutionary spirit, the new human, not just man, human revolutionary spirit, about the revolutionary love that Ernesto Che Guevara is talking about, for example. Because we really need to be able to think differently. We need to, there is this metaphor about tarantulas, that at certain point, tarantulas, they shed their own skin. We need to do the same thing with ourselves, because we are so much into the core, into the imperialist weight of ideology, that we also need to think creatively when we look at countries like China. And we need to understand that what we're looking at is a space of autonomy for us in respect of other countries like China. We don't want China to save us, neither to be an enemy, but to create a world where the universal reach of solidarity is there, yet maintaining that heterogeneity of struggles and values and respect, not bombing and bringing democracy a la NATO.
Thank you so much. And Aidan, I think you have the final question.
Yeah, so I guess my final question is just rewinding back, to retaliation, rewinding back to Iran. And it's kind of twofold, because I'm curious what you think are, the possible scenarios going forward from here in the short term in terms of the Zionist response, what that's going to look like. Momodou and I talked about potentially the Zionists trying to retaliate on one of Iran's allies. They struck Hezbollah, assassinated a commander, but Hezbollah responded very firmly through striking the military reconnaissance site in northern occupied territory. And so establishing again those rules of engagement, those firm deterrence lines. But then, shifting from short term and thinking long term in terms of if there is a war of attrition. You did mention that, the idea that the US is a stable entity and would nuke you on those lines. And I think a lot of people keep saying this rhetoric that if there was a huge full-scale regional war, that Israel as a nuclear that possesses nuclear weapons would just go out all crazy. But reality, and I might be naive to think this, but in the fact that I don't think that would necessarily happen because of that, again, that settler ideology, the settler cowardice, you could say, and then being that the Zionist entity is in a different stage of its settler existence. So I don't know what scenarios you're kind of thinking in terms of going forward.
I mean, yeah, let's try to. I mean, it is difficult because there are two things. When we think in terms of historical materialism, we try to analyze the world to provide a remedial action to what we think is the state of the world. So when going back to what you guys were talking about, which is when I say, Iran is this is our theatrics, or Iran is an authoritarian regime, and Trump and Israel is as bad. My analysis doesn't provide a remedial action to anything, because in the first place, I'm saying that everything is bad, the people need to rise. It doesn't make any sense. Because what kind of people? Who are we talking about? What classes? How are we identifying the people? Are we talking about the people of Iran that are supporting the government? Are we talking about the popular Palestinian classes that were cheering when they were seeing Iranian drones coming down over occupied Palestine? So that type of analysis is not historical materialist. It's some kind of gibberish that academics who are lavishly paid in Ivy League universities have to provide in order to confuse the masses. It's their role, it's their job. Willingly or not, that's what they do, okay? So, and I say this why? Because when we do an historical materialist analysis, we can envision, we can analyze how we reach to this point. But then when we look at the future, we can do scenarios. We don't do scenarios. We have to think strategically. Now, in terms of how we reach the point, I think we discussed enough. So when we see at the strategy, when we look at what kind of strategy the Zionists are going to take? This is a difficult question for us because Mamadou knows, I'm sure Christian and probably Aidan, you do too. For example, a dear colleague and friend of ours, Bikram, says that, there is this question of rationality, irrationality, which is true. We have seen in the case of Israel, which is Israel has not responded rationally, basically politically. The military force that Israel is using as a strategy does not translate into a rational political solution, meaning Iran has retaliated, but has said, this is a done for us. You did this, we did this. Politically, the message is, don't do it anymore, okay? What Israel is trying to do instead is to maintain, because the core of the project is to translate this utter huge amount of violence into a political project, which is settler colonialism, right? So when October 7 takes place, Israel's response is not to listen to whatever Hamas and the Palestinian resistance factions were asking, which was a prisoner deal exchange and so on and so forth, breaking the embargo, removing it, and so on and so forth. No, Israel actually kills its population because it goes into a panic mode, kills its own population, comes up with bogus accusation with rape, and makes us believe that people have been incinerated by Hamas, whereas they were their own tanks doing that to its own population. So the response of Israel from the very start is irrational. They need to reestablish what you asked me earlier, Aidan, at the beginning, which is the question of deterrence, because it's lost. They have been attacked, and in doing so, they've been taken off guard. So from the very start, Israel tries to reestablish an equation of force, the idea of deterrence, that has already lost, that has progressively lost, going back to the 2006 war against Hezbollah. But October 7th reveals that nakedly, so bluntly for all of us. And the attack of Iran from its own territory continues to show that. Now, the point is Israel going back? And by Israel, what did we say before? America is Zionism, Zionism is America. Is the US going back to the political table rationally, thinking, okay, we need to reach a political solution to this? Or are we going to continue irrationally killing and bringing and expanding the war? From October 7 up to now, we have seen an escalation only. So I would expect that the Zionists are going to retaliate. A retaliation, I think, is without any doubt is going to take place. I would be very surprised if they don't retaliate. Now, the form of that retaliation could be bombing Iranian interest in Syria again, because let's not forget that the initial strike on Iran was not on Iran, its territory, it was in Syria. So it could be a type of a cyber attack, it could be any type of other attack that Israel wants to take, but not in the form of let's bomb directly. They might get less, they might lose the urge to do it right away. They might. But in losing that urge, though, to retaliate immediately, they are going to start fighting the war at the tempo of the Axis, which is the war of attrition, which is good for the Axis and it's good for the resistance. Because the more Israel gets trapped into this war, the more it becomes unsustainable as a project. And there is this beautiful clip of the Sayyid, Hassan Nasrallah, for those who don't know, where he says, one of the scenarios that we've always been thinking about is that we might not even need to get to the point that we need to go to war with Israel, because they're going to start to live by themselves. They're going to leave the country because everybody has double passports. We're going to might just enter without actually a need for war. That is one possible strategic point of view from the side of the Axis. The Axis is set. It knows what kind of war it wants, and it hasn't changed its own political demands so far. If it continues to do so, it is like slowly eroding the legitimacy and sustainability of Israel as a political project in the region and for its own allies. And obviously, this indicates and signals an increasing decline of US imperialism. The other option is that irrationality expands and we might enter a wider, more bloody war at the regional level. With the consequences, obviously, that when the tempo of that escalation can produce consequences and repercussions that obviously are difficult for us at this moment in time and space to identify. I hope I made a little bit of sense there, Ada.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think this has been fantastic conversation. Honestly, I think we have a lot to think about. And Matteo, I really appreciate you coming on again. And a shout out to my amazing co-hosts and friends and comrades. And I implore everyone listening, please check out Dr. Matteo Capasso's writing, his Twitter, his journal. These are very important analysis in this time in understanding our moment. And until next time, peace out.